Welcome to all of you. I'm Nancy Birdsall, the proud president of the Center for Global Development. It's terrific to see this crowd here of what I know is a very both well-informed and passionate group of women and men. I want to say a word about why this gathering means a lot to me, the fact that it's at the Center for Global Development. About 2 years ago, when we were in the final stages of planning to purchase this space, which for the first time for the Center for Global Development would mean that we had a conference center. My colleagues cooked up that this space would be named Birdsall House. It was part of a fundraising effort, which was very successful. But as I think you can imagine, I was honored, of course, but also embarrassed and continue to be somewhat embarrassed. And I kind of resisted the idea. But then I decided that I would make a deal with them. And I stipulated that the idea of this center should be unusually not only a place to push out CGD works and CGD ideas, but it should be a venue for the community concerned with women and development and with gender equality. So when Andrew Preston approached us about hosting this Girls Summit, as you can imagine, I was tremendously pleased. It's a great way to signal that's the idea for me and for us at the center of the Birdsall House Conference Center. I'm very pleased to say that over the years, the center has contributed to the field. There are some copies of several books outside, of which we're very proud indeed, by colleagues who have been here. A set on health and several books on girls' education. I'm also pleased to say that we have decided to revisit the field and try to find where, as a center, we could have value added in what is obviously now, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, an incredibly rich body of policy work and research. And I'm going to ask Charles Kenny, who is our anchor and leader on our new initiatives, to raise his hand. He's back there, so that those of you now or after today's events who have some sense of what the center is about, you get in touch with him if you want to tell him what you wish we could do, where we could add value above and beyond, or at least complementing so much of the good work that's already happened. Before turning over the stage, I want to express my appreciation to the British government, especially, for its leadership on this issue and on so much else that's related to development. I understand that Prime Minister David Cameron himself pushed the idea of this Girls' Summit. And we have seen that leadership from the heads of government in the UK for many years. Resources may be fungible, but there is no substitute, I think we all know that, for high-level political commitment. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Patrick Davies, Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy, who will tell you much more about today's event. Patrick.
Good morning, everybody. And Nancy, first of all, thank you so much for you and the Centre for Global Development for hosting us here today in this wonderful space, which I think is very aptly called the Birdsall Centre. Thanks also to the US chapter of Girls Not Brides and the Coalition for Adolescent Girls for co-sponsoring the event with us and contributing to everything and all the arrangements. It's very clearly paying off with so many people here today. I'm sorry that there aren't seats for everybody, but it just shows how popular and important this event is. Nick Kristof, in his excellent book Half the Sky, says that like the battles against slavery in the 19th century and totalitarianism in the 20th century, the central moral challenge for our century will be the fight for gender equality. The two issues that you'll be discussing here today are at the very centre of that struggle. They are absolutely fundamental to building a bridge to get women and girls out of poverty around the world, into education, and into a full role in society, in social, political, and economic lives of all our countries. Girls around the world must have the voice, choice, and control to determine the course of their own lives. That's what's at stake today. I'm proud to say, and as Nancy referred to, these are issues which the British government, my government, takes seriously. This summit comes only a few weeks after another we hosted on preventing sexual violence in conflict in London a few weeks ago. So the Girls' Summit has the aim of rallying an international movement to end female genital mutilation and child and early forced marriage. Addressing the conference in London today, my Prime Minister said, "It is absolutely clear about what we are trying to achieve. It is such a simple but noble and good ambition, and that is to outlaw the practice of female genital mutilation and early forced marriage, to outlaw them everywhere, for everyone, within a generation." That's obviously a hugely ambitious goal. But as Nancy said, with political will and resources, that is, in our view, achievable. The Girls' Summit embraces community leaders, governments, international organisations, and the private sector. Together today in London, they will announce a range of ambitious commitments to tackle those challenges. But we should also be clear that the challenges that we are discussing are not just challenges for the developing world. They're serious problems in our own societies as well. It is estimated that 137,000 women and girls in England and Wales could have undergone genital mutilation. That's a huge and shocking figure. And so that's why the commitments that my government, the British government, is announcing today are both domestic and international. They include financial support for a UNICEF global programme to eliminate child marriage and a new training guide to enable public sector professionals in Britain to provide the protection and support for women and girls at risk that is so vital if we are to change behaviours. My colleague Emma Wade, sitting over here in the embassy, will say more about those announcements in a panel later. So as an embassy, we want to do our part to raise the profile of these issues in Washington and around the US, not just during the summit, but long after it's over. So with all your help, we'll try to do just that. So we look forward to working with you all in the months and weeks to come. This is not one single event. So with that in mind, we have a fantastic programme for you today. And fittingly, it's one that mirrors the two core themes being discussed in London. The first panel you have is on sharing what works, so showcasing the experience of different civil society representatives to show that these issues are definitely not too difficult or sensitive to tackle. It's really important on the subjects we're discussing today to remove the taboo and fear, and you'll see some of that in the discussions later. So instead, they'll tell you what really works and how we can build on the progress that others have made. The second panel on agreeing an agenda for change will include British and American representatives. I've mentioned Emma Wade from the embassy before, who will speak about the commitments being made in London today and how the US and UK can work together to continue to focus on these issues long after the summit. So our intention is for today's summit to be just the beginning. So it's great to hear that Nancy, that your centre will do some more work on these issues, and I'm sure many others will too. As I say, it's a challenging ambition we've set to get rid of forced marriage and female genital mutilation in a generation, but there is great cause for optimism if we work together. So with that, I think we should get started. And I'm delighted that the first thing we will do is show an Instagram video from London, What Freedom Is. Thank you very much.
Freedom is being able to be myself.
With your wife who is expecting a lovely baby.
La libertà è andare in giro in scooter per Roma.
India martin bazik bebekis dubarin het pisini met logale.
Freedom means to me that you're free to fly all over the world wherever you want to go.
Freedom means to you?
So much. Freedom means to be free to eat.
Freedom is to free from feeling of hatred, grief and ignorance.
Freedom is when you're able to express your feelings and make your own decisions.
Freedom is learning and teaching others.
I know what it's like to have no choices. I've been cut. I know what it's like to have no voice. I know what it's like to be silenced. And I know what it's like to feel alone.
I was 14 when my mother bought me a dress and said, "Put this on, you're getting married."
We are in such a special time right now. This is a time where every voice can be heard, every opinion can be considered.
We have the freedom to choose.
Choose to help give young girls and women a choice.
Take action, sign the pledge and end female genital mutilation and child early and forced marriage within a generation.
So that we can make a difference in this world.
While London is actually, celebrating this moment, we in DC are celebrating it as well. This is very unique because I think this never happened before, and I'm hoping next year DC will host the official Girls Summit. So let's think about that as a possibility. Today, before me, I have three extraordinary women who's going to be talking to us about this particular issue. And I know this audience, how many of you are currently working on this issue? So a good number of you in the audience are working on this, so you understand fully the challenges. But I think all too well you understand the opportunities of what's ahead. The opportunities in looking at what is it do we need to address in this modern time when we think about what are the opportunities for the world. And this issue of early and forced marriage is not just one of girls needing to be empowered. It's an issue that is critically important for the very economic prosperity of our world. So we can't look at it outside the context of what does it mean for the world to progress in the absence of girls being able to actually have the choice to live and fulfill life. So the conversation, we have very little time, so I'm going to get moving right away with the conversation. I'll introduce my three colleagues here. We're going to go one by one. Because of the time, we're actually going to have them speak, and then we'll have a dialogue back and forth, and then open the conversation for your questions. So if you have an idea and thought, just write it down. We'll get back to you right away. Right next to me is Ann Warner of ICRW, who's been doing extraordinary work on this particular issue. She's also with the Girls Not Bride Coalition. We also have Antonia Kirkland next to us, who's going to be talking about this particular issue as well. They've been doing some incredible research on the subject matter. And Jean Smoot, who's been working on both the national and the international issues. So I think we have a very strong and interesting dialogue, and I think more importantly, your insight on the issue is going to be critical to this conversation. Let's think about solutions, because I think the problems are clear. Girls unable to actually fulfilling their basic human right is something that is critical and that we all understand. What we don't fully appreciate is the solutions are simple. The issues may seem complex, but the solutions are simple. So Ann will kick us off with the conversation. Ann?
Sure. Thanks, Judith, and thanks so much to the organizers and to all of you for being here. It's really incredibly thrilling to see such a full room of people who care about this issue. And it's really gratifying also to be in a panel where we start right off with not talking about the problem that we know, we all very well know is an important and critical problem, but talking about the solutions. I've been asked today to focus on solutions towards ending child early and forced marriage and also supporting married girls. And the great news is that we actually do know a lot. A few years ago, my organization, the International Center for Research on Women, conducted a review of all the evaluated programs on preventing child marriage that we could find. We conducted went through a meticulous process, reviewing the literature, both published and unpublished literature, to find programs around the world that were focused on preventing child marriage. We found many, many programs that were doing this. 23 of them had a documented evaluation where they were using different methods to look at the end of the intervention, what difference had these activities made towards the issue of child marriage. They were very diverse in terms of their size and scope. Many of them were relatively small, reaching fewer than 15,000 beneficiaries. All of them were in the developing world, most of them in Asia, and particularly in South Asia, where we know there is the greatest number of child brides. And some of them had child marriage prevention as their explicit objective, their primary objective, and many of them had child marriage as one of many components of other issues they were trying to address, such as increasing access to education or health care. We identified across those diverse programs 5 key strategies. Those are detailed in this brief document, which I think is available outside. We also on our website have a longer publication that's available that goes into much more detail about the methodology and the findings. Because of the limited time, I'm going to talk only about 2 strategies, which we think, when you boil it down, are really the most commonly used and the most effective in terms of making an impact on this issue. First of all, working with the girls who are most affected by the practice of child marriage. Those are girls who are at risk of being married, as well as girls who are already married and who are among the most vulnerable people in the world. So there are a variety of excellent programs that are engaging these girls in groups in safe space settings and providing them with education and information as well as skills that help them build their confidence, build their communication skills, build their ability to save and manage their money, for example, to communicate more effectively with their family members, and to have social support, which many of them are lacking in their lives, that give them the confidence and the voice and the aspirations for leading a different kind of life. Also, many of the most successful programs are providing really meaningful alternatives to child marriage. We know that that's critical. Providing access to high-quality education, particularly secondary education for adolescent girls, instead of being married, reducing the barriers to girls going to school and getting a high-quality education in a safe and gender-equitable environment. Also providing opportunities for them to gain skills for their livelihood and job training abilities. Now, we know also that girls rarely have the power exclusively to decide if, when, and whom they're going to marry. So along with working with girls themselves, it's critical to work with their families, with their guardians, their parents, their extended families, as well as the community more broadly. And there are excellent programs that are mobilizing communities in different ways, raising dialogue about child marriage, about the consequences of child marriage, about alternatives to it, and about addressing the social norms that contribute to its continuation, and talking about how girls and women can be valued differently in society. So those two strategies, empowering girls and mobilizing families and community members, are very often implemented together. And we have lots of great examples, from BRAC Sophia program in Bangladesh to Population Council and Save the Children's program, Ishraq program in Egypt, to Population Council and the Ethiopian government's Berhane Hawan program in Ethiopia, CARE's TESFA program for married girls in Ethiopia.
And can you talk a little about the Ethiopia program? So
sure.
Some example in terms of why these programs are particularly effective in Ethiopia, where the rate of child marriage is particularly high.
Mm-hmm. And the region of Amhara, where the rates of child marriage are about 75%. There are a number of great initiatives that are being implemented in collaboration with the government, as well as non-governmental organizations. And one of the groundbreaking programs is their Berhane Hawan program, which worked with girls as well as their families and community members, engaged girls in non-formal education, also provided support for girls to return to school, and also involved the community in community dialogue, which is a popular format in this particular region of Ethiopia for talking about social issues. And also, interestingly, provided a transfer, a conditional goat transfer for girls who had completed the program and remained unmarried at the end of it. They and their families were provided with a goat at the end of the program. And this was shown to be extremely effective in decreasing the likelihood of girls being married, and it's now being scaled up to reach more girls in Ethiopia, as well as Burkina Faso and Tanzania. So there's a lot to be learned. There's also a great program that's implemented by CARE, evaluated by ICRW, that's working with married girls who, in this particular region, again, are among the most isolated and vulnerable in the world, and providing them with sexual and reproductive health information, as well as access to village savings and loan, and has shown really some effective impact over the couple of years of its implementation.
It seems to me a lot of what you're describing has to do with the economic piece, and we're going to get back into that later. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to let Antonia talk a little about some of the legal implication around this particular issue.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. Good morning. Equality Now, my organization, as many of you probably do as well, believe that child early and forced marriage and FGM are human rights violations that result from inequality and discrimination against girls because they are girls. I've been asked to focus today specifically on FGM and the progress that we're seeing towards preventing FGM, which affects approximately 3 million girls every year. FGM, as many of you may know, involves removing all or part of the female genitalia. This could include cutting off the clitoris, the prepuce, the labia minora, majora, and even possibly stitching the two sides of the vulva together. Piercing or pricking has also been called a form of FGM by the World Health Organization. And we really believe that all forms of FGM are an assault on a girl's mental and physical health, and they have lifelong health consequences. We have seen, however, that strong laws and policies at the regional, national, and state level are an important tool for raising awareness, for empowering women and girls to be able to say no to the practice, for holding governments accountable to their commitments to implement the law. And enforcement of the law can also serve as a really strong deterrent and actually prevent FGM. In Kenya, for example, the Tesoro Tomanak Initiative, or TNI for short, was calling for the prosecution of a circumciser and a father of a 12-year-old girl, Cezano, who died from FGM on August 8, 2008. After Equality Now and TNI raised the fact that the police were not acting and mobilized public pressure on the issue, they did arrest the circumciser and the father. And TNI and Equality Now together would show up at court and make sure that the prosecutor and the police would show up as well, as they weren't always want to do that. And then finally, in April 2010, the defendants pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and they were convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. And now TNI told us that after this case, there was a chilling effect, and it seemed like less girls were being cut in Cezano's community. And overall, in the Narak district, where she was from, there was a decrease in FGM from 93% in 2003 to 73% in 2009. And we think this could be very well due to TNI's approach, which is very comprehensive. It's not just using the law, but it's also holding dialogues, intergenerational dialogues, grandparents, parents, children to talk about FGM. Also providing shelters to girls running away from FGM, particularly during the school holidays. And making sure they stay in school and are reintegrated into the community. In the UK, we're also working towards a very comprehensive approach to FGM with government agencies. And the UK actually has had a law against FGM since 1985, but it was not being enforced. But now, through a lot of advocacy, the Director of Public Prosecutions has an action plan. Health workers have come up with guidelines on how it should be treated as child abuse, actually. And there was a hotline put in place last summer. And finally, there are cases actually moving forward. So we're hopeful that with organizations and governments working together, that this will also result in a decrease in FGM in the UK. And in the US, we've seen that public pressure has also helped to prevent FGM from becoming a socially acceptable practice here. So when the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a policy statement in 2010 suggesting that doctors could maybe do a ritual NIC to satisfy cultural requirements, there was an outcry. Our members were mobilized, our partner organizations mobilized. We got the World Health Organization and UNICEF to put out a joint statement condemning this policy, and they actually had to withdraw it after about a month.
Antonia, you were talking earlier about intergenerational strategy. Can you talk about, because very often we think of women, we think women need to be empowered, but grandmothers, mothers-in-law, aunties, they are critical in preventing this practice. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little about some of the prevention strategy and how these group of people have been used to effectively decrease the practice in the environment where you're describing?
Well, I think it's not just raising awareness about FGM itself as an issue, but also education, which we'll probably talk about more later. But UNICEF did a report last year on the statistics around FGM and the social norms and dynamics that contributed to it still being in place. And they did find that the more educated a woman is, the less likely she is to allow her daughter to be cut.
Yeah. Jean, I think the context, we're talking about Ethiopia, places like outside the US or the UK, even though there's been a lot of conversation about the UK. But what is the complexity in reconciling the issues in both when you think about the developing the world and in the context of the US and in the UK?
Right. Thank you very much. So the Tahrir Justice Center, my organization, is a national legal advocacy organization here in the U.S., and through our forced marriage initiative, we've gained a unique vantage point on what's going on here in the U.S. We provide national technical assistance, we conduct outreach and trainings, we develop policies, and we marshal a growing national network to prevent forced marriage. And so I'd like to share with you a little bit of what we see when we see cases of forced marriage involving U.S. citizens or residents. This could be someone who could be your neighbor. This could be someone who could be your child's classmate. Perhaps a 16-year-old girl whose parents are insisting that she marry her second cousin overseas, even though she's repeatedly said she doesn't want to. She tries to reach out to teachers at her school, and they don't know what they can do to help. Her parents have bought plane tickets, and they're going to leave right after school lets out for the summer. Or it could be a 21-year-old refugee woman who's lived here for years. She's now entering her last year of college. But her parents tell her that her grandfather has taken ill and is near death, and she has to travel to their home country to see him. When she gets there, they take her documents, they burn her green card, they take away her Western clothes. Then they hold her hostage in a relative's home, and they beat her and tell her that the only way she'll get back to the U.S. is if she submits to a marriage. So these are just a few of the many kinds of scenarios that we see playing out in different families and different communities all across the U.S. And they prompted us to, in 2011, do a national survey of what was happening in the field. And we were stunned at the response. Over 500 respondents from nearly every state replied and reported collectively encountering as many as 3,000 cases over the prior 2 years alone. And these were teachers and counselors and police officers and child protection workers and shelter workers and domestic violence advocates. And in all of those sectors, we were finding that people were encountering these cases, but that they also weren't always sure what to do. So what we understand from this survey and from our own work is that this is really just the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing here in the U.S. And also, another stunning finding was that this was an issue that has an incredibly diverse impact. For those of you who think you know what the face of forced marriage looks like in the U.S., think again. Because in our survey, we found that families were originating from at least 56 different countries of origin, many different religious backgrounds. And through our work, we've also learned about forced marriages happening in multi-generational American families, too. And our study joins a growing body of research that's documenting the problem and also the breadth of the problem. So the bottom line is that forced marriage is happening in the United States and that thousands of individuals may face forced marriages each year. And other Western countries have reached similar realizations sooner than the US. The UK has estimated, say, 5,000 to 8,000 forced marriages are reported annually across the country. In Germany, 3,500 people reported in 1 year alone to information and counseling centers to seek help for forced marriage issues. And so Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, these are all countries that have recognized they have a domestic problem with forced marriage and whose governments have made commitments at the national level to address it. So to turn now to what can we do about it and what's working, I think all of us in doing this work are very keenly aware of the one chance rule, that someone who is at risk of a forced marriage may have only one chance to reach out for help, one phone call that they can make, one text to send when they're trapped overseas. And so really one of the most powerful tools we have responds to one of those most urgent needs, which is to make sure this is on the radar of all those professionals that are encountering the cases and didn't know what they were seeing before and didn't know how to do anything about it. This can make a critical difference and prompt them to ask questions and make offers of help. So in the UK, again, for example, they do these road shows every year, some 30 road shows annually. Joint NGO and government teams go out and train thousands of professionals. And this has led to a substantial uptick in calls to their national helplines. So the average that the UK's forced marriage unit receives now is about 1,500 calls a year. A leading NGO receives sometimes 600 calls a month. So these are effective in getting people to know where to call for help, service providers to reach out for assistance in triaging cases. And I'm very pleased to announce today, I'm very excited to share with you that the Tahrir Justice Center, in collaboration with Canadian collective of survivors and activists and with local partners in 6 cities around the US, is launching a major national outreach tour starting this September in New York. And we hope this will really build a movement here in the US and start a national dialogue. We've seen repeatedly how this makes a life transforming difference for people. What does it look like? It looks like night and day. You have a university counselor sitting in her office one day dealing with a depressed student who's seemingly upset about breaking up with her boyfriend. And after our training, she realizes, you know what? What I've been hearing is that was the precedent that her family forced on her to a forced marriage overseas. So they realize the problem and then they can galvanize to do something about it.
So does the solution look different in the context in the UK and the US than it does in a place like Ethiopia?
I think to some extent what we need to do is to assess what we have to work with here. We do have some laws. We do have some protective structures. We need to know how to ripple an awareness of forced marriage dynamics through it to make sure that we know how to adapt those means for these purposes. And we also need to come up with some new tailored remedies. So again, turning to the UK, they have a special form of a forced marriage protection order, and it is designed specifically to take into account the unique challenges of those situations. Minors can seek it, for example, on their own behalf. If a person has been taken out of the country already, someone else can seek it on their behalf. And it can do some incredible things in terms of compelling families to return people from abroad and other things that are tailored to that circumstance. So I think, we look at the things that have been done that have been most effective have been getting out the word, making sure it's on the radar of people, making sure they have tools and know-how, specialized expertise. So the UK also has a forced marriage unit. And it's sort of that saying, if you build it, they will come. And we're seeing that happen in the UK and in other countries that have these sorts of resources. The UK's forced marriage unit in 2005, when it was set up, was recording maybe 25 cases of rescue and repatriation that they did every year. Just 25. A few years later, 500 cases, and that's where they stand now. About 500 cases of rescue and repatriation, and as I mentioned before, the National Helpline is handling about 1,500 calls a year.
So the legal framework is critically important, as Antonia was describing, but I wondered to what extent Antonia, can you actually follow up on some of the question around, in her context, she's describing multi-generational reality, whereas the law is in place. So how do we actually, what do we know in terms of the effectiveness of what work around the legal framework?
Well, in terms of FGM in the U.S., I should also mention that there is a law against it here. And in fact, last year there was an amendment which also criminalized girls being taken overseas for the purpose of FGM, which often also goes hand in hand with child marriage and forced marriage. And now it's really a question of implementation. There haven't been any cases yet. It's about the agencies all working together, health agency, education, Department of Justice, USAID, all of them coming together and seeing it as not just a domestic problem here, but a global one as well. And I think when the law is taken seriously and enforced, then that helps the younger generation say no to the practice and say to their parents, no, it's illegal here, I'm here, this can't happen.
So Jean, maybe you can talk about some of the institutional framework that you work on in terms of trying to get different governments to work together to respond to what Jean is describing.
I'd actually like to be able to respond directly to what you asked about the legal framework. I think, one of the things that we know is that there is no silver bullet to any one of these problems, right? That we need to come at it from many different angles and that there are many different kinds of legal reforms that are effective to hold people accountable, to prevent practices, to empower survivors to seek protections. And so, the criminal approach is one approach, and I think it's one that has a place in the spectrum. But I would note that while there have been no prosecutions in many of the countries that have criminalized these practices, there have been 575 of these forced marriage protection orders issued. And so people are coming forward and seeking help for themselves in ways that they feel they can access. I think it's also the case that we need to look across different laws and policies. So no one law will be enough. Age of consent to marry laws in the U.S., I think some of you would be shocked to know how low it can go if you have parental consent or judicial consent. And in some states, there is no lower limit if you have judicial consent. And so these are things that we need to turn the lens that we turn to the rest of the world back on ourselves and say, what kinds of standards are we setting here? But we also know in the U.S. as well as abroad that we won't accomplish this through legal reform alone. That's disappointing to hear as a lawyer, but truthfully, it will take that kind of community-based outreach and change. And I think we need to make sure that wherever that commitment is made to legal reform, that we back it up with that community engagement, because one without the other will fall flat.
Yeah. And, you know, you were talking about the legal framework, that's not enough. And I think in your earlier conversation, you were describing how what was effective in Ethiopia was that economic component. Mm-hmm. To what extent do we need to actually have heavily on the economic reality of our communities? Because often communities make decisions, or parents say, you know, I have to marry off because of economic reason. How much of that is a reality?
Yeah, just to echo what my colleagues have said, our systematic review also looked at legal approaches and found that they are necessary but not sufficient towards changing norms, attitudes, and practices related to child marriage. So they're a very important part of the framework for preventing child marriage, but they alone will not end child marriage. You're exactly right. The context of poverty is extremely important to consider in the developing world, where there are fewer choices, where there are fewer options, and where the social norms are not permissive for girls to work outside of the home or to participate politically in their communities, where there aren't good schools for them to go to, and labor markets that provide opportunities for them to apply skills that they would learn in school. The options are very limited, and that's where you find child marriage being practiced more heavily. So we have to also address these economic factors. We also have to convince people that child marriage has an economic cost. In the short term, child marriage is often practiced for economic reasons, to relieve a burden on the family, to gain bride price, to marry daughters early because the dowry might be less, and that in situations where dowry is common. But those sorts of short-term economic incentives for marriage have very long-term consequences, and we have to raise the awareness of that at the community level and also at the national and global level. Today in London, we're announcing a partnership with the World Bank. ICRW and the World Bank will be working together on a 3-year study to define the economic costs of child marriage, which hasn't been done before. And this will be used, what we find in multiple countries around the world will be used to do advocacy both at the national and global level as well as at the community level, to raise awareness of what it really means when you lose a generation of girls to marriage.
So what I'm hearing you guys saying before we open to the audience for questions is the legal framework is important. We need to put the law and policy in place. At the same time, what's worked effectively is when there's a combination of community intervention, community support, and obviously, in the case of Ethiopia, in all the examples you highlighted, the economic viability of the community is key to actually ousting the practice. Okay, I think we have a lot to think about. There's a lot of work we need to do, but I want to open the floor for some questions from the audience. Please state your name, your organization, and to whom you're referring your question.
Dana Weckeser, Global Health Partnerships Consulting. I would like to hear from all of you or whoever has the answer. I don't remember hearing anything. Do I need to start over? Okay. I don't remember hearing anything from any of you about the faith-based groups, because I would like to think that the faith-based groups need to be part of this. And are they being part of this? And if so, how's it working?
One of you take the question. Maybe I think your community intervention, Antonia, can talk about some of the religious institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in several countries, FGM is thought to be a religious tradition, but in fact, it's not in any religion. And when you have religious leaders speaking out against it, that's very effective and very important. And we're working in Mali with groups on the ground there to get that kind of support and mobilize them for a law, because there is no law in Mali, and Mali has a very high prevalence rate of FGM.
Yeah. Did you guys want to?
Just to note that that's what we're doing here in the U.S. as well. Yeah. We're collaborating across many different kinds of organizations. We started a few years ago with a core of 20 or so organizations in our working group that's grown to now over 400 organizations, or nearly 400 in our national network. And among them are faith-based organizations that are committed to working on addressing this problem in their communities and across communities. So,
yeah. So we'll take 3 questions at the time because of the timing issues. So we'll take 3 questions. Over there, please. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Thank you. My name is Will Davis. I'm with the United Nations Development Program Office here in Washington. We're going to see the Millennium Development Goals come to a close next year. And some of the areas where we've seen the toughest progress around women and girls. For this next set of goals that governments are going to begin negotiating, what would you like to see contained in them to try to continue progress on combating FGM or forced marriage?
Good question. Next, please.
Hello, I'm Sarah Engebretson with Population Council and one of the co-chairs of the Coalition for Adolescent Girls. The Population Council is generating evidence on what works to delay marriage, and Anne mentioned the Burhani Haywan program, which delayed marriage by 2 years. I think my question is directed to you, Anne, about how cost-effective and sustainable some of the approaches were that you found.
We'll take one more question on this side if there's anyone. Okay, gentleman again over there.
I'm Mark Engman, U.S. Fund for UNICEF. We should probably have a much longer discussion on the U.S. side, but to just clarify a little bit, there's, in terms of there's no federal mandate or federal rules regarding child marriage. It's all state-led. And so if that's the case, I guess I'd like to explore a little bit more, what is out there on the U.S. side. What can you tell teachers? What can you tell parents? I'm a little frustrated that you have to work with Canadians to roll out a program in the U.S. So where is the U.S. government on this matter?
Right. Well, and yes, thank you for that comment. I would say this, just to give you a sense of what's out there, there are about 10 jurisdictions around the country that do have some forced marriage-specific legislation, but it wasn't designed to address the kinds of cases that we're seeing. It arises in some bizarre contexts, abduction schemes from the 1800s and that kind of thing. So I think we do need to look at what else is needed, but we have a host of laws already. We have child abuse laws, we have domestic violence laws, we have some of the components that go into forced marriage situations, whether it's abduction or holding someone hostage or kidnapping, whatever these sorts of things are. They are already addressed through laws, and they are already addressed through support structures, domestic violence shelters, and other counseling and service centers that need to see forced marriage as falling within their mandate. For example, we need to make sure that shelters see the need to take someone in, that 16-year-old girl I mentioned, for example, is to prevent her from becoming a victim of domestic violence, rape, and other horrors down the line. And not that they have to, and same with protection orders, that we need to see it in a preventative way, not that we have to have this backlog of all this horror behind them before we'll reach out and help. So I do think, yes, many solutions rest at the state level, but there is no substitute, as we heard earlier, for clear national leadership. And we have seen that time and again be the theme that runs across this panel and other successful efforts, that if you have the tone set at the national level that helps drive, catalyze, and coordinate all of these other efforts, that's what enables you to rise above the stovepipes of the child protection authorities in state X and the DV advocates in state Y. You're able to make sure that those efforts are driven at the national level, coordinated at the national level, and rolled out that way.
So, Anne, maybe you take the question from Sarah and Antonia, the post-2015 question.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Sarah. I think that the POP Council's evaluation will tell us a lot, actually, about cost effectiveness, and I know that's a strong emphasis in the evaluation that is happening. So we're going to be excited to see what the cost effectiveness of different kinds of components is. But there are a range of different kinds of strategies that we've reviewed. Some of them are really these community-based programs that are focused on ending child marriage and promoting gender equality at the community level and are quite comprehensive and include a lot of different components. Those have one cost structure. But then you also have programs that are connected with larger scale initiatives within the education sector, for example, that are increasing girls' access and boys' access to education. And if we can include a more deliberate focus on getting girls who are at risk of child marriage as part of those kinds of initiatives, we can really get a lot more bang for our buck in terms of those kinds of programs. So I think we don't want to look at them only in terms of kind of boutique community-based programs. We also want to look at how we can leverage other sectors and investments already being made to address child marriage more strategically.
Antonia?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question. You know, the Millennium Development Goals, which started in 2000 and are going to expire next year, were really meant to get at global poverty. But unfortunately, they missed out a very major factor in ending global poverty, which is violence against women and girls, including child marriage. So as part of Girls Not Brides, which is a coalition of over 300 organizations working on the issue, we've been pushing hard at the international level, at the UN, to make sure that the next framework for development includes very specifically a target on violence, and then also a target on eliminating all harmful practices, especially child marriage and FGM, by 2030. And that discussion is going on among member states, and we really hope, actually it's being led by African states, but we hope that the US and UK can strongly support that in the next framework, and also that the General Assembly put out a really great resolution on FGM about 1.5 years ago, and we think it's time now that they also do one on child marriage so that it's seen as a really global issue, and really they take the lead from Africa and the African Union, which has an End Child Marriage campaign that just launched a couple months ago.
Unfortunately, I've been told that I have to wrap up, so I'm going to give you guys just 1-2 seconds to just say what is the one thing we know that's working, and we need to do more of that and invest more resources on that, because the next panel is going to be the government panel, so they may want to hear what you have to say. One thing.
Well, I'm going to say that we know a lot about what works, but collectively, these programs only reach a tiny fraction of the girls who are at risk for child marriage. So we know we need to do more. We know we have a lot of good information and evidence to build on, and we have to start doing it. Individual projects and programs will not end child marriage. They have to be part of a cohesive, coordinated global response and a strategy with concrete and measurable outcomes. So that's what I hope we'll see.
Funding and strategy. Antonia?
I would say everything she said.
Okay.
And also that individually we can also take action. There's a petition by JAHA, the Safe Hands for Girls group, asking the U.S. to put out a comprehensive national action plan. We've seen that letters to governments do work, and they take notice. So you can do those through our website as well.
I think that we need to develop the capacity and resources in the federal government to address forced marriage in the U.S., and we also need to develop that capacity and those resources among those NGOs and those service providers in the field who are regularly encountering cases. I am mindful of the impact of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act in the U.S. It was passed in 1994 originally, and it was an attempt for once to put a national priority on addressing domestic violence and pulling together all these different sectors and influencing through funding and through those supports the kinds of responses and the kinds of attitudes to domestic violence around the country. And I think we are, to some extent, with forced marriage in the U.S., where we were with domestic violence some decades ago. This is a hidden problem. We need to make it visible, and we need to address it and tackle it across sectors and across actors.
So we hear it. So we're going to need to actually invest and increase the leadership. And I think with that understanding, we have a lot of work to do, and let's keep moving. Thank you. Right now, we're going to show you a video from the UN General Secretary.
Dedicated practitioners, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this important summit. Female genital mutilation and child marriage violate the fundamental rights of girls and women. FGM causes pain and trauma, disrupts schooling, and perpetuates poverty across generations. Child marriage compromises the development of girls. I commend global leaders and brave activists confronting these problems especially the courageous young women in affected communities. They deserve our full support, like Farmer Mohammed, who inspired me so much when we met in March through the Guardians campaign. I pledged to her, and I repeat today, I'll continue to raise my voice about the urgency of ending these harmful practices. For years, UNFPA and UNICEF have led our global effort to end FGM in affected countries. But in our globalized world, we also need to address problems in the diaspora communities. The General Assembly supports this goal. The Girls Summit Charter will strengthen existing efforts and spur new partnerships. We need laws that protect women and girls. We should scale up community responses, and we must change mindset so all people reject the violence, marginalization, and the exclusion of women and girls. I count on this summit to advance results. Let us preserve the best in every culture and leave the harm behind. Thank you.
One more video. I think today we've heard a lot of experts and individuals working on this issue. We're about to see a video from someone who's been through the practice and her own insights into what the solutions are.
Hi everyone, my name is Jaha and I'm coming to you from London. I came for the Girls Summit that's being organized by the UK government as well as UNICEF. What I want to tell you guys is they're doing amazing in the UK. I've met the survivors and I've been working with Equality Now on this issue for a while now. You know, in the US, I believe that we are lagging far behind because we've had our petition since end of February. And the US government still has not responded to our petition, even though we have more than 220,000 signatures. In the UK, it only took them a few weeks for them to respond. So we are urging the United States government to do more about it. Equality Now has been great partners in getting the word out, and then as well as Change.org and The Guardian. And, you know, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy that they're doing this. FGM is a human rights issue. It's child abuse, and it's time that we focus on ending it. So thank you, guys.
Thank you. The next panel is up.
Good morning. My name is Rachel Vogelstein. I'm Director of Women and Girls Programs. And FGM is not only a moral imperative, but a strategic imperative that affects U.S. foreign policy interests like prosperity, development, and stability. So I am incredibly pleased to be joined today by a distinguished panel of experts and government representatives to discuss the road ahead and what the international community needs to do to finally bring about an end to these practices. So sitting next to me is Carla Capel, the Chief Strategy Officer at the U.S. Agency for International Development, an expert on gender issues who has also served as USAID's first Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, and as a Senior Advisor to USAID Administrator Raj Shah. Welcome. Next to her is Wanda Jones, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who previously was the director of the Office on Women's Health. Welcome, Wanda. And then Emma Wade, the Foreign and Security Policy Counselor at the British Embassy here in Washington, who has had a long and impressive career in the UK's Foreign Service. Welcome to all of you. Emma, I'd actually like to start with you, if I may. The UK has really elevated the profile of women's and girls' issues this summer, certainly with the summit today, as well as the Global Summit to End Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict that took place last month. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what the UK government is hoping to accomplish through all of these summits and what outcomes and commitments specifically will come out of the meeting in London today. And a word also about what the UK government in particular is committing to.
Sure. Thank you. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here and see so many faces in the crowd. I think you're absolutely right that for me as a representative of the British government, it's a particularly proud moment to be representing a country that really is taking these issues around gender equality so seriously, both in terms of what we're doing domestically to encourage more women into senior positions in government and in boardrooms, but also looking internationally and supporting that women, peace and security agenda around the world. We've had a couple of mentions of the Ending Sexual Violence Ending Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative. I'd also look forward to the NATO summit in about 5 weeks' time, where the women, peace and security issues will also be on the agenda there. So, we're trying to bring these, we're trying to mainstream these issues across the whole piece of foreign policy and security policy so that, we are connecting the dots and kind of getting out of these stovepipes that we find ourselves in. I think looking at the particular issues that we're focused on today, I would mention some of the stuff that the UK government has already been doing. We've had some references to that already. But in terms of FGM, last year my government became the largest international donor on FGM issues with a program worth about $50 million focused on supporting around 17 African countries on these issues. We have an FGM. FGM has been illegal in the UK since 1985. We had the Female Genital Mutilation Act in 2003. On forced marriage, we've heard about the forced marriage unit set up in 2005. And actually one of my enduring memories of a trip to South Asia in around 2005 was going with the minister for that region and going up in a small plane, flying over this country, landing somewhere and coming back with an extra passenger, a young woman, 15-year-old girl from the UK who had been rescued from a forced marriage in that country. And she left with flip-flops, no shoes, nothing, no bag, nothing. I mean, she was so relieved to be out of that situation. She was quite happy just to leave with nothing, and knew that going back to the UK, she wouldn't be reunited with her family because it was her family that had put her in that dangerous situation in the first place. So, these issues have affected me. It's an enduring memory for me of that visit. I think looking forward to today and the summit, it's ambitious. We like to do ambition with our summits these days. So we're bringing together community leaders, faith leaders, somebody mentioned earlier, international organisations, countries, and the private sector to have this conversation, to look at what works. And to look at what more we need to do domestically and internationally to address this issue. And it's around raising awareness. It's around breaking that silence, breaking the taboos around this issue, which prevent so many of us talking openly about these issues and understanding the scale of what's happening around us, with the hope of building this global momentum so that it's not just the West telling other countries what to do, but actually this is about providing research and funding and support, both moral and financial support to countries that are tackling these issues themselves. And I think that's a really important issue. So we are hoping that countries, organisations, individuals will sign up to a charter today which kind of galvanises this momentum and sets out some actions for what we can do to address the issues. And we're encouraging everyone to come up with their own individual commitments as well. Plus, for everyone sitting in the audience, if you want to get active too, you can join the online pledge. So it's girlsummitpledge.com. So you can go on and join your voice to those of thousands of others who are pledging to end this stuff. Just very briefly, international and domestic commitments for the UK today that we are announcing. So internationally, we have an extra $40 million to join a joint donor UN program, which is around ending child marriage in some of those countries that have the most problems around this. And that's supporting national measures and community initiatives in those countries. We've got an extra $50 million for a new research program, and that's about finding the best ways of transforming the lives of poor girls. Domestically, my Prime Minister this morning announced a new program around prevention and care, which in the UK amounts to about $2 million, which frankly I think is an extraordinary amount of money and really impressive. And a whole raft of things around punishment and enforcement, so making sure our laws provide that framework, that legal framework to address the issues, and also training for our police officers so that they know what to look for and how to respond to the issues and victims. It's about protection and support for people who find themselves in the UK in these situations, so further training and funding for our public services across healthcare, across police officers, across criminal services, so that together, there's a coordinated effort to respond to the issues. But it's also about prevention. So how do we engage faith leaders? How do we engage communities to change behaviours and change beliefs around this? And in addition, we're hoping that other people will join with some of these commitments. And so we expect something in the region of over $150 million of additional pledges from the international community, and more than a dozen developing countries attending the summit today, committing to act to end FGM, child early and forced marriage within a generation. So it's exciting stuff.
A lot of important initiatives and commitments coming out of London today. Carla, I wonder if we could turn to you. You've spoken in the past about the importance of employing an integrated framework when addressing these issues that really recognizes the intersectionalities between, for example, health and education, employment opportunities. Why is an integrated framework so critical to the U.S. government's efforts? And can you tell us a little bit more about what USAID Administrator Shah is over in London talking about today?
Great, thanks, Rachel. Before I turn to this specific question, I first of all wanted to congratulate the UK and the British government for both organizing the summit and the series of events that have really shined a global spotlight on a range of issues for women and girls. It's exceptional to have the kind of focus and really peeling back the onion to start with the sort of broad conversation about gender-based violence and women and girls' status, and then drill deeper on specific issues. I also wanted to thank the Center for Global Development, Girls Not Brides, and the Coalition for Adolescent Girls in organizing the event this morning. It is quite extraordinary to know that I'm tag teaming with Administrator Shah, who's in London, saying similar things and making similar commitments in real time. And I think it's indicative of the level of global commitment and the kind of momentum that's being created around these issues writ large. Turning to the question of integration, I think that the conversation on the first panel really pointed to exactly the kinds of issues that are fundamental to how we are transformative with our investments. And we heard about how these investments right now tend to be on a smaller scale, they tend to be within communities, and they tend to cut across various sectors. USAID and the U.S. government released the U.S. strategy on preventing and responding to gender-based violence globally in 2012. The big emphasis in that strategy was around integration with implementation plans for USAID and for the U.S. State Department. USAID subsequently also published a vision for ending child marriage and meeting the needs of married children. And what we've been really focused on since that time is how do you approach thinking about these issues in ways that deal with different sectors. So in the health sector, how do we begin the conversations about the costs of child marriage and female genital mutilation, and how do we integrate those into broader conversations about child and maternal health and family planning? In the education sector, how do we create an atmosphere and an education environment that is not conducive to gender-based violence, that talks about issues related to child marriage, that pushes off the age of marriage, and at the same time keeps young girls and boys in school so that they get an education, and they as well become healthier when they do marry and move into the workforce. When we're talking about rule of law, how do we think about human rights issues and legal issues in ways that contemplate the kinds of issues that were talked about in the first panel related to whether it's domestic violence or child abuse, how we implement those laws when we're thinking about the range of different concerns in creating solid democracy rights and governance on the ground in countries around the world. How do we integrate attention to issues that women and girls face? When we're thinking about economic growth, how do we ensure that women and girls can fulfill their economic potential, which we know at the end of the day enables them to have greater voice and influence in family and community, and therefore gives them a greater role in deciding who they marry, when they marry, and how they practice their own healthy practices to ensure a long and successful life. That's really the way we think that we make transformation. We've committed today to a number of additional programs, particularly investments in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Yemen, that will build on programs that have existed and really complement efforts to do things like change behaviors and attitudes with efforts to enforce and implement legal reform and the implementation and realization of law enforcement. What we're also looking at is a broader commitment to integration across the board. And so while it's not part of our pledges today, I'll mention that in Haiti, we're about to be looking at how we integrate attention to gender-based violence writ large into all of our sector programs so that we really see attention to this fundamental issue to women and girls' livelihood and well-being as a comprehensive part of our portfolio writ large. That's how we think we will make change and we will make transformation. And those are some of the examples, and I can speak to others as we continue the conversation.
Great. So a word there on what the U.S. government is doing to tackle these issues internationally. Wanda, I wonder if we can turn to you to talk about what the U.S. government is doing to tackle these issues domestically. We heard a little bit on the prior panel about a survey from the Tahrir Justice Center with respect to prevalence. What do we know about prevalence, FGM, child marriage here in the U.S.? Whom does it affect, and what is the U.S. government doing?
On the prevalence issues specifically, sadly, we know very little. We have few solid data to guide us in our estimates. I led the effort 20 years ago to develop the first national estimates, and we created, and we acknowledged this up front, it was largely a house of cards. Many of the DHS, the demographic and health surveys from Africa and other practicing regions of the world were still underway. We didn't have firm data. We had Naid Tubia's published work to cite as estimates, but many of those estimates were not validated by DHS. Some were high, some were lower. We took what we could get. We also made assumptions about acculturation, and the acculturation literature is so incredibly skimpy. You know, we know so little about child development in particular. We think we know a lot, and we do. Those of you who are child growth and development specialists know, and yet there's still so much we don't know. We don't know from acculturation specifically, how does your leaving your home country, totally uprooting, whether you are an immigrant voluntarily, whether you are a refugee, whether you are displaced and have been in numerous camps before you land in the U.S. in this particular case, how does that influence your ability to adapt your own cultural beliefs and practices, to maintain your spiritual practices, your faith practices, and then to be sort of turned loose, if you will, in the U.S. environment where your language is not the language of the nation, where you're very lucky if you can connect to a community. And we make every effort through our Office of Refugee Resettlement to make sure that refugee populations can be supported by similar communities where language can be shared and help that process. But we don't have good data on what it means to acculturate. And is there a magic inflection point? So we made many assumptions in deriving those estimates of female genital mutilation, cutting. We also had to acknowledge that our data were already old, our census data, because the decennial census done like 1990, 2000, 2010, there's a very large subsample that has a real drill down. If you've ever been lucky enough to get one of those extraordinarily long questionnaires, there's a subsample which is very detailed information. We had that from 1990. From 1990 until 1996, late 96, when we started the analyses, 120-some thousand women and girls had immigrated from Africa. We couldn't even count them because we could not get the detailed information to fit into our model. So we knew we were behind getting started. And our estimates of 168,000 women, fraught with many limitations. A few years later, Nawal Noor led a group at Brigham and Women's, published updated estimates of 220-some, I think. I don't remember numbers well anymore, but we considered 5 years later, and with 2,000 census information, her estimates were at least consistent with ours, but we all still recognized, even though she had better DHS data, many limitations. On child early and forced marriage, I would venture that we have even less knowledge and no good ways of forming models here. You know, the irony is not lost on me personally that marriage as a civil contract regulated by states, there's a whole lot more activity right now to say who can't get married than there is around really ensuring that marriage is a voluntary commitment. You know, providing the protections, entitlements, et cetera, that marriage as a civil contract is meant to do. When the parties to that marriage are not mature enough, and that doesn't mean old enough necessarily, but not mature enough to make appropriate judgments about, you know, the voluntariness and the longer-term consequences, then we've got a problem. As mentioned by the panel earlier, some states allow no floor. Any age can marry with judicial or with parental consent. A handful of states, that age is 12. Most states, it's age 16. But this is a states' rights issue. So at the federal level, aside from zeroing in on the issue of child early and forced marriage and using the levers we have, much as we've begun and began almost 20 years ago on the female genital mutilation cutting issues, alerting Customs Border Protection, the immigration passport officials, the Office of Refugee Resettlement and other components within the Department of Health and Human Services alerted to serving these populations culturally appropriately and sensitively, and recognizing when in fact girl children might be trafficked. We might see these children in our trafficking programs. We may see them in some of our family planning centers. And we're beginning to think quite expansively about where we may encounter, but we're just getting started on the child early and forced marriage
So
issue.
a lot of gaps and clearly a need for better data collection and analysis with respect to those issues here in the U.S. So we've heard from everyone on the panel about some of the work that the UK and the US governments, the work that the governments are doing, and some of the commitments that are being made today in London. And the real test of success, it seems to me, will be in the implementation. So I wonder if quickly, before we go to questions from the audience, I can ask each of you to just reflect on how we can hold governments, your governments, other governments, multilateral organizations, the private sector, civil society, the groups that are making commitments today, how can we hold them accountable to those commitments? And what is it going to take to keep these issues on the agenda, child marriage, FGM, and importantly, the issue of adolescent girls more generally? What is it going to take to keep that on the agenda as we head into a negotiation over a new set of development goals? So perhaps, Emma, I can start with you and we'll just go down the line.
I think there's the huge challenge. In many ways, convening people to and encouraging them to make those commitments is the easy bit, and then the really hard work starts. But I think leadership is absolutely critical. Without it, you just don't bring the weight of countries, private sector companies, communities together and to bear on these issues. And I think
I mean, one of the things that will come out of this summit is an agreement to look annually at the commitments that people are making today in London, to assess those on an annual basis and publish the results of that analysis online. And that may not sound like very much, but actually it's the reputation point for companies and countries that I think is important, particularly with all of us, tweeting and Facebooking and the like. So holding our organisations to account for that. And I think there's so much around raising awareness, breaking the silence, and continuing to talk about it. So I think, well, it's one thing we definitely need leadership from the top, but actually we also need this. This global movement of people who are saying no more. That this is not the world that we want to live in, and we will collectively and individually put pressure on our companies, on our organisations, to keep the momentum going on this.
Wanda.
And I'll add, it's a point where I can actually step in as well, recognize the UK for its leadership here and the co-sponsors of this event today, because that voice is important, the voice of communities, the voice of lived experience, the voice of those who have served and have seen the consequences. All of our voices joined together. For those of us within the government, being able to carry this work forward, even without resources, because there's tremendous passion for the people we serve, recognizing we can't reach every single person, but we keep trying. And I never know when I pick up the phone, is this the person who's going to make a difference out there? And I keep at it. I've never lost faith and I've never lost interest. And there are many like me in the Department of Health and Human Services, at state, at justice, at the Department of Education, throughout the US government, with great passion for seeing that girls have every opportunity to fulfill their potential. But we can't do it alone, and it will take the voices of those in the community, often, ringing our phones, sending us letters. We get blast emails, any means whatsoever, petition drives. We've got to marshal all of these efforts to raise the awareness and to take steps individually and as community coalitions and as governments, local, state, and federal, at all levels, to build in accountability and to take the steps necessary to ensure full potential for all girls and boys.
Carla?
I think there are two pieces. I think one really important piece is that we measure the results of our work and track that and track our success and our traction based on the results achieved rather than the dollars spent. The dollar spent is important as a sort of interim indicator, but at the end of the day, the results we achieve, not only in terms of marriages foregone or girls staying in school, but also how that then relates to the well-being of countries and societies around the world. Because at the end of the day, it's not solely about the well-being of the individual woman or girl, but also how that relates to the broader developmental mission of development agencies, but also of countries themselves. And then I think the second piece, in terms of how you maintain momentum and carry it forward, also relates to how you hand this off to partners and leaders in the countries that are most affected by these issues. Because we, sitting here in the United States or in London, can raise the alarm, can put resources towards this, but at the end of the day, what we need to be doing is enabling local voices to make change in their own societies and countries. That's what will give it staying power, and that's what will create momentum, to my mind, and really lead to the kind of wholesale transformation that we're seeking.
I'd like to now open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Please state your name and your affiliation and to whom your question is directed. We're going to start with questions from two of the co-sponsors of today's event, Girls Not Brides and the Coalition for Adolescent Girls.
Hi, this is Judith again. I'm the program director for Plan USA Because I'm a Girl campaign, as well as the steering committee member of the Coalition for Adolescent Girls. I wonder if one or all of you could touch base on the need for, private sector, the government, and civil society to really work together across different sectors. Because I think earlier in the first panel we heard about the role of education, the need for strong leadership across communities, the private sector, and I think throughout the conversation, one group that's missing is really the role of the private sector and how can, not to sort of say hold them accountable, how can they play a leadership role in addressing these issues by connecting women's and girls' well-being to national economic development?
We'll take one more from the Girls Not Brides Coalition.
Thank you. I'm Lyric Thompson. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at the International Center for Research on Women, and also have the pleasure of co-chairing Girls Not Brides USA. My question is for you, Carla, as I'm sure you suspected. We, as you know, have been calling, along with the US Congress and the UN Human Rights High Commissioner and advocates globally, for the kind of coordinated approach and whole-of-government approach that was, I think, first discussed by my colleague Ann Warner and referenced throughout the first panel and beginning to be this panel as well. With the US commitments today, I've heard, I think, new programs in Yemen, Nepal, and Bangladesh. I've heard a little bit less about what that overarching policy framework is that's going to give the mechanism for the interagency passion that was just discussed to really think about how do we create a roadmap and have that measurable progress that you mentioned. So I was just curious if you could expound a little bit on the efforts at the framework level, and if you need any ideas, Girls Not Brides USA has a brilliant policy paper out front articulating our recommendation.
So private sector, perhaps each of you can reflect a little bit on that, and then Carla on the U.S. government framework.
Shall I kick off?
Go ahead.
I think it's absolutely critical to get the private sector involved. I mean, we see it across the whole of the development piece, that money from private sector companies and as well as personal contributions far outweighs what governments can offer. And I think it's more than money as well. I think this is about a reputation for companies, and I think we're seeing an increasing number of private sector companies concerned about what their customers think about them. And so, you're seeing this rise of corporate social responsibility action, and a lot of that actually directed towards gender equality and supporting girls and women. So I think, vote with your wallets as well as your feet and your thumbs as you're doing social media, and tell these companies what it is you expect from them, because they've got the money. And many of them are scrabbling around trying to find the cause that they're going to focus on, which sets them apart from their key competitors. So I think let's go for it. And they've got jobs. So these are the kind of companies that should be offering opportunities to all sorts of girls. So I think they are absolutely a critical player in this whole game, and connecting in between private sector, between governments and civil society is the only way that you make concerted progress on any major issues these days.
And I would just emphatically put ditto marks under that statement, with perhaps a little bit of an extension, that the role of public-private partnerships is critical to success, but it's not the only thing. And if any piece of that is out of balance, it's less likely to succeed. And even when a company with the best intent in the world comes in, and I'd see this, I've done most of my international work in the Middle East, in the Arab world, so look at me, imagine how different I look to be somewhere in the Middle East. Even though I'd speak Arabic, it was completely a disarming kind of a situation for me to be in a market or just some conversation with folks at various meetings. But to assume my lived experience is anything like the lived experience there, to sit in an audience and to hear quite smugly that, our girls and women are so educated, 70%, 80% with college, graduate, whatever degrees, and then to have the hallway conversations because of the inability of those women to be gainfully employed in the areas in which they have studied because of cultural norms around where women, where girls can access work and other things of a free society. It's quite a revelation that it's one thing when corporate America comes in and wants to support and build up educational programs for girls and women. But if there's nothing to be done and no civil society engagement around really enabling that 50% intellectual capital of that country to begin to move toward a productive engagement and progress for women and baby steps. I'm not talking change overnight. I'm talking even baby steps. That's where the change has to happen, because numbers look good, but they can really lead you astray. And I really want to emphasize that government can't do this alone. Corporate America can't, or corporate anywhere in the world can't do it alone. Civil society's role and engagement, and really lead with our enabling support. Let civil society help guide us and inform our efforts and measure and evaluate, so we know that we're making a difference. Because what good does 70% of women with graduate or college degrees do if 10% of them are employed? So,
Carla.
So on the issue of the private sector and civil society, I endorse everything that has been said already. I would add two pieces. First of all, civil society and private sector are enormously important to holding us all accountable for fulfilling the commitments and moving the agenda forward and continuing to light a fire under us and maintain that degree of momentum. I think there's another piece too, which is individual companies can have a really important role in trying to help shift norms, whether they are working where we work. For example, I remember visiting a factory in Bangladesh, and I asked them about incorporating attention to gender-based violence into their efforts in economic growth, not knowing what the answer would be. I was honestly curious what they would say. And they said, oh, that would be very easy because we're integrating women into the workplace. So we have sessions on how men and women can work appropriately in the workplace. It would be quite easy for us to incorporate attention to issues related to various forms of gender-based violence, but including the role of girls and child marriage and domestic violence and others into those programs. So there can be a very tangible, direct connection as well for the private sector, and they can help move the envelope forward. That, in addition to the funding, the support as implementing partners on the research agenda and the absolutely path-breaking research that International Center for Research on Women, that Girls Not Brides, that others are undertaking care. I would welcome your brilliant policy recommendations. The structure for interagency cooperation, and there are others, Beza, Vicky, Kathy, who can speak with greater detail, who are here, but there is a structure of different working groups under the auspices of the strategy that have been set up and that meet regularly. And I spoke specifically to programs and integration, but there's one related to research, and really some of the questions that came up more extensively in the first panel related to at what cost are the interventions that are being implemented, which ones can be scaled up, how do you best engage faith leaders and men and boys so that when we do seek to be transformative, we're doing that in the most effective and efficient way possible. So research is one group that cuts across different agencies of the government. A second is on monitoring evaluation, and how do you see the results and then create a learning agenda that carries us forward and improves the efficacy of implementation on an ongoing basis. A third is around pilot countries, and if we should be organizing within countries, what countries those should be, and what does that organization mean. And those working groups exist and continue to have discussions on an ongoing basis, and that's separate and apart and additional to the work that AID is doing or that the State Department is doing independently.
More questions from the audience. Perhaps we can take 3 at a time so that we can get as many as possible. We can do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll go to some in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Hawa Brople, and I come from Liberia, West Africa. We currently run a program for adolescent girls in 6 regions in Liberia. And today I would just like to advocate for more grassroots support. We see a lot of research, and we also see a lot of funding coming into the country, but the grassroots organizations are really having a challenge and difficulty getting support. And like all the experts have said here today, the community is where the root of all support should come from, because change can only be started at the community level. So that would be my plea today. Thank you.
Nancy.
I was reminded, despite what you just said, when you were talking, especially what Carla said about national leadership, that last week the BRICS started their own bank. And that initiative is in part a reaction to the sense that the rich countries are running the world, and that rich countries have certain standards and values that don't always take into account trade-offs as they're seen in the developing world. So that's a long preface to asking. We didn't hear much about the leadership, the extent to which the leadership of the major developing countries has or can be brought around to taking leadership on this issue. You know, I'm thinking of Modi in India. Can he be brought around to saying something because Prime Minister Cameron encourages him to do it? Or the DFID staff work through their, in India, work up? Could President Obama be talking to Dilma Rousseff or to the next president of Brazil? This would complement the point that we've heard much more about, that much has to be done at the community level, at the grassroots level. My sense is that in the case of fertility change, leadership at the national level on the issue of allowing women to make choices, this is starting 30 years ago in a few countries, was hugely influential. Is the G20 a setting at the head of state level for pushing this, as well as in the UN? So that's a combination of a plea from the other end and a question to anyone on the panel. Thank you.
Great question, and also worth noting on the issue of child marriage that, of course, 40% of the world's child brides in India. Thank you for that. One more question in the front, and then we'll go to answers.
Hi there. Thank you very much to the whole panel. My name is Archie Piatti, and I'm in the policy department at Tahrir Justice Center as well. I wanted to direct a question at Dr. Jones. I appreciate so much hearing your passion and commitment both to the FGMC issue as well as to the issue of early child and forced marriage. It's so good to hear that you share the same passion and commitment that we do in the NGO community. I wanted to ask about U.S. commitments today at the Girls Summit. I've been able to access them and was reading that we have made a number of commitments on early child and forced marriage, it sounds like, globally, and we have made a number on FGM, both domestically and globally. I wanted to ask if you could speak a bit to U.S. commitments on early child and forced marriage here in the U.S. in terms of programs, activities, funding. As you heard in the earlier panel, we are at Tahrir Justice Center calling for coordinated governmental action as well as funding to the communities and the service providers as well as training, et cetera, so that we can have the kind of coordinated response that we're seeing our sister countries having. I'd love to hear what you think and what your advice would be to the community in terms of how we can help push that agenda forward. Thank you.
So support for grassroots organizations, leadership in developing countries, and a coordinated U.S. response. Who would like to go first? Carla.
I'll go first. So I'll focus on the first two questions, and I think in some ways they relate to one another. I think at the end of the day, we are only going to end these harmful practices if we have really concerted partnership and movement on the ground in the countries where you have highest levels of affected people, whether that is with local civil society organizations or whether that is political leadership within the country. We have two emphases within USAID. We have vastly increased the support that we're providing to local organizations on the ground, whether those are non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations. One of the challenges we face, and that's shown in the percentage of our dollars flowing to local entities, which has increased by something like 30% in 3 years. I mean, it's been quite exceptional. That said, we know there's a real challenge with a lot of local civil society organizations meeting the bar in terms of writing proposals and in terms of doing the kind of accounting that we call for in the U.S. government. And so one of the things we are very cognizant of is the need to close that gap so that we can increasingly support local non-governmental organizations by increasing their capacity to meet our requirements, and also by increasing our capacity to have more flexible funding. So I think that's a really important part of this. Another part of what we're doing is what we're calling the new model of development, which really calls for a very intimate partnership with local governments and private sector entities to move agendas forward. And when we've really pushed on national and local leadership to make a commitment to move the needle on specific challenges, we've seen extraordinary results. So, for example, we have Saving Mothers, Giving Lives was one of these public-private partnerships, which has reduced maternal mortality rate in target districts in Uganda and Zambia by 30% and 35% respectively in very, very short amount of time, a couple of years. And that's because we are really working hand in hand with leaders in the country to make real on commitments and to work those commitments through the government. The same is true of some of the work that we've done with some of the ministries in Afghanistan, where the health ministry has had an extraordinary impact on the health and well-being of mothers and children in the country, with the largest decreases in mortality that we've seen in the entire world in the last decade. It's only because we're working with local authorities and with local organizations and local leaders to make that kind of change. So I heartily endorse, and I actually don't think they run counter to one another. I think they go hand in hand, and it's about how you make change on a really global scale.
Wanda?
I'll jump into the commitments issue. And to be honest, on the child early and forced marriage side of the equation, we're just beginning to look domestically at what commitments might consist of. On the FGMC side, certainly CDC updating its estimates, some of the community-based funding, outreach efforts, et cetera, all of that regaining momentum, I would say, because it had not been neglected, but it had lain rather quiet for many years. But updating those estimates is going to be huge. But back to the early and forced marriage, we are considering a consultation around these issues sometime this fall, and no further plans. And I often wonder, how did I get here today? Because I don't have time to engage like I'd like to engage with the working groups. And I get pieces of what's going on, and it's very, very exciting. But, the most recent discussions, I will have to plead that I don't know the most recent, but I will say conversation around community consultation, absolutely critical, because we need that voice. We need to understand who's working in the space, what are the problems being seen. For us, for the department, the U.S. has no national system of health care. So while we do fund federally qualified or community health centers, community and migrant health centers, and then certain other very specific programs for health care in the U.S., when we look at service delivery sites, we have perhaps an opportunity where girl brides, obviously girls and women who have been cut, but on the child early forced marriage side, we might have opportunity there in those programs to at least raise awareness to the providers about engagement, recognition. Our Office of Refugee Resettlement is our front line as refugee populations are brought into the U.S. and are settled in various communities across the U.S. and maintaining some visibility and linkage to the community organizations and the other entities serving those populations, that they are acutely aware of how this practice can be hidden, buried within communities. The trafficking, the Health and Human Services houses the Anti-Trafficking in Persons program. on the domestic side, again, shelter and linkage to services. So that's a place where there likely are some child brides trafficked in, raising awareness, being prepared. We have resource centers funded through through the Violence Against Women Act, through the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, that can be resources as well to communities. There is within the African diaspora, a very specific part of the Institute for Domestic Violence in the African American community that is totally focused on the African diaspora and is beefing up those services, just as an example. So, we've got many avenues for us for Health and Human Services to explore. I have not been on calls or in conversations where I could hear education for, in the school systems, et cetera. Because again, many of these efforts are state level. It's going to take leadership at the federal level and a call to action. And I think many of us are there. We're ready to have those conversations. So, I could offer stay tuned. I don't want to say my usual trust us, we're from the government, because I know how that usually turns out, I'm ashamed to say. But nonetheless, there are many, many passionate and committed people working very hard on this right now, and I'm personally thrilled. So thank you.
Emma, you have the
I'll
last
keep it
word.
brief. So absolutely hear your plea on grassroots support and agree it's very important. Just for interest of time, picking up the bit about rich countries and leadership of developing countries. I think both with the Girls Summit and the Ending Sexual Violence Summit, it was important for us to have countries that have some money in the room, because actually, you do need some cash to help finance these initiatives. But even more importantly, to have those countries where the problems are most prevalent and to shape the conversations around those experiences and their commitments. And I think that's quite clear in today's Girls Summit, the sort of strong South leadership, if you like. I would point on the broader question of raising these issues at leaders' levels. I think, for me, I was completely blown away by the fact that for this Preventing Sexual Violence initiative, more than 150 countries in this world of ours signed up to ending that, as part of a broader conversation around gender equality and women, peace and security. And that is an extraordinary achievement, I think. And we, certainly in the UK, see Girls Summit as a continuation of that conversation. And those are the kinds of conversations, these are the kinds of events that we're having around the world to raise awareness in whatever country we are in. I would also just point to the G8 declaration around sexual violence and gender equality last year, which we championed. And picking your point up about G20, I think it is important. We've been talking about how this connects in with economic empowerment and ending poverty and all that sort of stuff. This is the kind of that's the kind of agenda that the G20 is interested in. And so this kind of golden thread of development, as my Prime Minister has described it, I think threads through the G20 work as well, as we're looking from development to progress.
Well, before turning it back to Nancy for some closing remarks, I'd like to congratulate the UK government on its leadership and thank the British Embassy and the Girls Not Brides Coalition, the Coalition for Adolescent Girls, and of course our host, Nancy Birdsall, and the Center for Global Development for hosting this important event today. And last but certainly not least, I'm grateful to all of our panelists for a robust discussion, so please join me in thanking them.
Our thanks to the sponsors, especially the UK government, and to all of you. Lots of great ideas, lots of good information. It's really impressive. And it's a combination of chilling and inspiring to have spent these 2 hours. I hope every one of you will go to girlssummitpledge.com and sign up. Thank you very much.